Oh, hey, Bimo. You want to play too?
No, I do not play such games with Jake.
The CardWars playtest is currently available and constantly changing. Every Friday, in fact. This isn't just going to be boring, flat patch notes. There are tons of interesting new additions to the game worth hearing about. There's an entirely new win condition, and Korn has a completely new mechanic, to name just 2 things. I'm also going to talk about why crystals have not been implemented into the playtest yet, because they were supposed to be the next addition to the game. Crystals were delayed because I decided to refocus onto the victory condition of the game itself. The TV show presents the victory condition as a total annihilation of every single thing your opponent has, so that's been the goal thus far. Destroy all enemy creatures and structures. The objective being that simple and general isn't a bad thing. It leaves room for a variety of strategies and approaches, but it has a tendency to draw the game out really long and prevents decisive victories. After seeing the game playtested by other people, I decided that the current game objective was a bigger issue than I had predicted, and came to the conclusion that it wasn't something that should be fixed through card balancing and tweaks. So I set out to design a new win condition, although it's probably better described as a new game mode, which unfortunately meant I needed to put crystals aside for a moment, otherwise I'd risk having to redo all of the work that I did for them. I wiped away the old win condition and gave myself a blank slate, and so I decided to turn back to the source material for inspiration, since I don't plan on deliberately veering away from the original CardWars game if I don't need to. In the show, they only explicitly call out the ruling for victory twice. Jake declares that he's won because Finn has no creatures left, and the announcer declares Team Dignified has won because the board is frozen into a cat's game. Although even that's not specifically stated, but that's an easy assumption to make. Regardless, we see 3 other game conclusions, 2 of which literally wipe the entire enemy board, and the final one being this guy demoralizing this corn soldier. Thankfully, none of this information is particularly rigid, and so even though the show is more or less pointing to total annihilation as the objective, that's where we are with the game now, and it needs to change. So, I took inspiration from these things, Finn and Jake's castles. They are big, blank structures with lots of health, and so I'm going to use them as home-based, stronghold, citadel, fortress type things. You know, like defend it, destroy your opponent's thing type of deal, you get the idea. Now's the fun part, taking that stronghold concept, which is so simple that I literally just explained it without even being particularly accurate, concrete, or clear, and figuring out how to actually implement it, because it's never as easy as just that. How much health does it have? Where does it start on the board? Where does your opponent's start on the board? Can it be moved? Can it be altered at all? What's stopping you from camping and slowing the game down even further? Does it count as a structure, or is it a new type of card? You get the idea. The only question here that had an interesting answer was the 6th question I asked. If you're rude and don't remember because you weren't paying close enough attention, that was the one about preventing camping. If you have a single base structure, you can hoard tons of high health creatures there, or even just 1 or 2 with the right abilities to deny entry. So aside from having to place down your big base structure, which I'm calling your stronghold, you have to place down 2 settlements as well. These settlements are less important, but when they're destroyed, your stronghold takes 2 damage. Your settlements will then regenerate at the start of your next turn just to be destroyed all over again. I also added the elemental typing to the settlements, giving them each the effect of their elemental basic structure as well, since the stronghold and settlements are replacing the basic structures. For those of you who don't know, basic structures were structures that you had to defend because when they were destroyed, you incurred some sort of element-specific negative effect. So I just took that element-specific negative effect and put it onto the settlements, so aside from your stronghold taking damage, you might have to deal with some other penalty as well. Structures have also been reworked around the stronghold game mode, so instead of placing them individually, you place them onto your stronghold or settlements and they act like extra health on top of the settlement or stronghold until destroyed. This gives structures more inherent value and keeps them from just being ignored. It also means that you can only have 3 structures at any given time now as well. And I mean, that's the gist of the stronghold victory condition game mode thing. I'm not 100% sure if I'm happy with it yet, but it refocuses the game so that the positioning of your creatures and structures matters a lot more now, which is good. That said, it has given the element which focuses entirely on board position and control a huge buff. Doors became a bit too powerful, or at least several cards which controlled the board in specific ways became instantly overpowered. Like the Door Fairy, which used to make it so that when it was in the enemy kingdom, the other enemy lands aren't adjacent to it anymore. A card like Door Fairy simply needed to be changed, but I've begun to walk a fine line at this point in development when it comes to gameplay and balancing. I mentioned that I'm not 100% sure if I'm happy with the stronghold yet, but it's tricky to tell if the stronghold is the problem or the cards. For example, if the game mode feels too aggressive, I could go through and balance out all the cards that are way too aggressive and causing the problem, or I could find a way to solve the problem in the game mode itself. I prefer altering the game over the cards for 2 reasons. One, it's way easier. I don't have to make my way down a huge list of revisions and then re-import everything and yada yada yada. And the other is that the tighter I make the game, the more fun I can have making the cards themselves. If the Stronghold game mode is self-sufficient with mechanics that inherently disallow you from being too aggressive or too defensive, then I don't have to worry about maintaining that ecosystem as much when I'm introducing new cards. You can connect the dots as to why Crystals was delayed around this, but now it is the next thing on the docket and it will be out by the end of this month. I hope. I've been working on their functionality a lot behind the scenes actually. The shatter mechanic is still my planned mechanic for them, but the idea that they sustain their element by spawning little fodder creatures like shards feels like a lazy solution to keep them in the game. The other elements have clever systems to keep them moving even while playing cards and losing creatures if you're doing it alright, so I'm going to try to do my best to make sure Crystals feels that way too. One main change that's extremely likely is that Shatter will trigger upon your creatures taking damage instead of on death. This way, instead of having another element deal with rewarding creature death outright, Crystals can focus instead on keeping their units alive and managing their damage intake to trigger their Shatter abilities. It'll be interesting to see just how much I break the other elements when I introduce whatever mechanics the Crystals will come with. Husks are going to be abused to deal self-damage to crystal creatures, and I have all sorts of ideas that have to do with death prevention, and I just know they're going to be exploited with the Lizard Hole leaders. Speaking of new mechanics, a viewer suggested the idea of adding kickers to Khorne, which was just so fantastic we did it almost immediately. It was good timing as well, since the Stronghold mechanic ended up being a huge buff to the Doors element, and Khorne needed a bit of a pick-me-up. Now, I had to be taught what a kicker was in terms of Magic the Gathering, but I have to guess the term actually comes from the game that inspired MTG, which I am familiar with, Cosmic Encounter. In Cosmic Encounter, 2 people play attack cards face down and then reveal. The player with the higher total wins. If you have a kicker in your hand, you can declare that you're also playing a kicker face down along with your attack card. Kickers are multipliers to the number you played and can obviously make a huge difference, but it can also be a bluff since there is actually a ×0 kicker. There's more depth than that, but you get the idea. In Magic the Gathering, a kicker is an additional cost you pay upon playing a card to get an extra, generally instant effect, which is pretty much what I'll be adapting into Khorne. This concept works incredibly for Khorne specifically because of how it pairs with the Husk mechanic. Essentially, we just took cards that had room for it and added an ability called Offering. When the card is played, if you also pay its offering cost by discarding that many husks from your hand, you get an extra effect. A few examples are the Martyr of Maze, which is normally a weird defensive card, but paying its offering cost actually allows you to play it on your opponent's turn after they declare their attackers. The Khorne Seed Maggot, which essentially gets to punch an enemy creature when you play it with its offering cost, bearing in mind this punch works like a normal attack, and Khorne Seed Maggot will also take the damage back from the target, and the Khorne Gladiator, which can just get a huge attack buff when played with offering, making it a 4/3 instead of a 1/3. You can check out all the changes yourself in-game on Tabletop Simulator. Instructions on how to get the game and get playing are in the description, a YouTube community post, and our Discord. I know a lot of people don't have Tabletop Simulator and want 2 things, a PDF of the rules and a list of all the current cards in the game. The first one, the most updated rules PDF, is right here, if you can read fast enough, and the list of all the current cards doesn't exist. We get requests for this a lot actually, and while it will be made eventually, the rate at which the cards in the game are changing would make updating such a database impractical, so that will come once the cards are a bit more stable. By the way, Globulin wanted to let you know that soon we're going to be hosting a tournament in our Discord server, so keep an eye on our community posts and the Discord server itself for updates on that. Thank you so much for watching, and please subscribe. It makes a big difference. If we get 500,000 subscribers on this one video, I'll release Crystals immediately, even if it's not ready and you wouldn't want it anyway.